The letter he never sent it began on an ordinary morning that felt strangely heavy. Sandra opened her window and watched the quiet sky stretch endlessly above Los Angeles. The city was already awake, yet something about that morning carried a stillness that pressed against her chest. She had not spoken to Keanu in years, not really. They had crossed paths at award shows, exchanged polite smiles, maybe a small joke between interviews, but the real conversations, the deep ones, had been buried long ago beneath time and silence. She told herself it was just how life moved on. But that morning, as she poured her coffee and stared at the empty chair across the kitchen table, she felt something tug gently at the corners of her heart. A memory, unfinished. The letter had arrived 2 nights before. No return address. Just her name written in familiar handwriting that had once belonged to endless days of laughter and friendship. For hours, she kept it unopened on her nightstand. Maybe she was afraid of remembering what she had worked so hard to forget. When she finally opened it, the words felt alive, almost trembling. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but every sentence carried the weight of years. "Sometimes waiting is not about time," it read. "It's about the hope that time will bring meaning." She read it again and again until the ink blurred under her tears. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. She knew that handwriting, that tone, that quiet honesty that only one man had ever carried. Keanu. She tried to dismiss it as nostalgia. Maybe it wasn't from him. Maybe it was some fan or someone playing with coincidence. But deep inside, her instincts whispered otherwise. She thought back to the last real conversation they had, the night after they finished a film together. He had stood outside her trailer, rain falling softly on the studio lot, and told her something she had never forgotten. That sometimes the kindest thing 2 people can do for each other is step away before their timing destroys what was pure. For years she tried to understand what he meant. And now, reading that letter, she wondered if he had never really stepped away at all. That night, unable to sleep, she walked through her living room filled with memories she couldn't control. Framed photographs, gifts from friends, awards on shelves, all reminders of a life that looked perfect from the outside. But perfection can be so silent that it starts to echo. She thought of how he used to notice things others didn't. The way she hid exhaustion behind laughter, the way she stayed quiet when she was hurt. He had seen her before the world did, and maybe that was why it hurt so much when he disappeared without explanation. But what she didn't know was that while she was moving forward, he was standing somewhere still, quietly watching her rise, quietly waiting for something he couldn't even name, waiting for a reason, or perhaps for forgiveness he never asked for aloud. The next morning, Sandra decided to find out the truth behind that letter. She called an old assistant who had once worked on one of Keanu's film sets, asking if he knew where Keanu was these days. The assistant paused before answering. His voice grew lower, almost hesitant. "He's around," he said. "But he's different now. He spends most of his time away from the city. Quiet places, you know. People say he's writing something." Writing something? Those words sent a shiver down her spine. She thanked him and hung up, heart pounding. She remembered how Keanu used to write. Always in notebooks, always in private, as if words were the only way to speak when his voice couldn't. Maybe that was what this letter was, a piece of something larger. Maybe he had been trying to say more. Later that evening, she found herself driving through the outskirts of the city without really deciding to. The sky turned from gold to blue to a deep velvet gray. She followed the winding road past hills and quiet homes, her thoughts louder than the music on the radio. Every few minutes she thought about turning back, but something stronger kept her going. Not curiosity, not nostalgia, something deeper. The need for closure, or maybe a chance to fix something left undone. When she reached a small bookstore tucked behind a gas station, she stopped. It looked exactly like the kind of place Keanu would hide in, quiet, almost invisible to the world. She walked inside. The old bell above the door rang softly. An elderly man behind the counter smiled at her, a knowing kind of smile that made her uneasy. "Looking for someone?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "A friend. I think he used to come here." The man leaned closer. The one who always sat by the window, writing in that leather notebook? Her breath caught. Yes, him. The old man's eyes softened. He hasn't been here for months, but he left something with me. Said someone might come looking one day. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small brown envelope. On the front, in that same familiar handwriting, were 3 words. For when she's ready. Sandra's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a photograph of them taken years ago during a film break. She was laughing, mid-sentence, and he was looking at her. Not at the camera, not at the world, just her. Behind the photo was a short note. The world moves fast, but the heart doesn't. Some moments choose to stay. Her knees weakened. She sat on the nearest chair, clutching the photo. Suddenly, she realized it wasn't about romance or regret. It was about something purer, the kind of loyalty that doesn't demand to be noticed, the kind that simply waits. She thanked the man and left the shop quietly. Outside, the air felt heavier, but she could breathe again. She didn't know where to go next, only that she had to keep going. Every piece of this mystery was pulling her closer to something, or someone, who still believed in her even when she had stopped believing in herself. As she drove away, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. No name, no greeting, just a line she instantly recognized. You finally opened the letter. Her heart froze. She looked at the screen, at those simple words that carried years of silence and meaning. Before she could reply, another message appeared. There's one more thing I need to tell you, but not here. And then a location pin. It was somewhere deep in the hills, near a lake they had once visited during filming many years ago. Sandra stared at it for a long moment, her pulse echoing in her ears. Everything inside her screamed to let it go, to not open old doors, to not fall into the past. But something stronger whispered that maybe the past wasn't finished with her yet. She turned on the ignition, and as the car disappeared into the deepening night, the question that would define everything hung quietly in the air. Why had he never stopped waiting? The road back to silence. The road to the lake stretched long and quiet, a thin ribbon of asphalt winding between dark trees and distant hills. The headlights painted the path in silver light, and Sandra's reflection on the windshield looked almost like someone else. Someone searching, someone afraid, someone remembering. She had no idea what she was driving toward. The night hummed softly around her, the hum of an engine mixed with the restless beating of a heart that didn't know if it wanted answers or peace. The last message on her phone stayed open on the seat beside her. The words glowed faintly in the darkness. There's one more thing I need to tell you. She repeated them under her breath, trying to read their tone. Was it an apology, a warning, a confession? After all these years, she didn't even know if she wanted to hear it. Part of her wanted to turn back and pretend the letter had never come. But something deeper kept pushing her forward. Something older than reason. Maybe a promise her soul remembered, even if her mind didn't. When she reached the lake, it was almost midnight. The moon hung low over the water, breaking its reflection into trembling pieces. She parked the car near the old wooden pier where they had once sat during a filming break. She remembered how Keanu had thrown pebbles into the water and said quietly that some people come into our lives not to stay, but to remind us of the parts we left behind. She hadn't understood it then. Maybe now she was beginning to. There was no one around, just the sound of the wind and the slow rhythm of waves touching the shore. But then she noticed something. A single lantern glowing near a cabin at the edge of the lake. She stepped out of the car, her shoes crunching softly on the gravel, and walked toward it. Every step felt heavier than the last. The cabin looked untouched by time. She knocked once, twice, and then the door opened slowly. Keanu stood there, older, quieter, and somehow more fragile. His hair was longer, streaked with silver near the temples, his face carrying the calm of someone who had stopped running a long time ago. He didn't look surprised to see her, only quietly relieved, as if he had been expecting her all along. "You found it," he said softly. She nodded, unable to speak. Years of words crowded behind her lips, too many to release at once. He stepped aside and let her in. The cabin smelled like cedarwood and rain. Books were stacked everywhere and on the floor, on tables, near the window. On one corner sat a half-finished painting of the lake outside, the colors muted but full of life. She turned to him, her voice trembling. "Why now? After all this time, why write to me?" He smiled faintly, eyes distant. "Because time stopped feeling like time after a while. I thought if I waited long enough, maybe the silence would make sense." "And did it?" she asked. He looked down. "Not really. But it taught me that some people are not meant to be forgotten, no matter how quietly we try." She sat down on a wooden chair near the fire. It took her a while to find her words. "You just disappeared, Keanu." No calls, no explanations. "I thought I did something wrong." He shook his head. "No, you didn't. I left because I couldn't give you what you needed back then. I was lost, and I didn't want you to wait for someone who didn't even know how to stand still." His honesty hit her harder than she expected. She looked into the flames, remembering the times he had stood by her when no one else did. The quiet support, the way he listened without judgment. She realized how much she had missed that kind of peace. "The letter," she said quietly. "Was it the first you wrote?" He hesitated. "No, it was the only one I sent. There were others." He walked over to a drawer, opened it, and pulled out a small box filled with folded papers. Dozens of them yellowed with age. "I wrote one every year," he said. "Every birthday, every film release, every time I saw you on a screen and felt proud but couldn't say it out loud. I wrote them all but never mailed them." Sandra felt tears rise. "Why keep them?" "Because they were my way of waiting," he said. "I couldn't move on, but I didn't want to hold you back either. So I kept writing to remind myself that love doesn't always need to arrive. Sometimes it just needs to stay somewhere safe." The words sank into her slowly, like rain into dry soil. She reached for one of the letters and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was steady, every line filled with gentleness. It wasn't romantic, not really. It was something quieter, deeper. He wrote about her strength, her laughter, the way she made others feel seen. It wasn't about wanting her. It was about believing in her. She closed the letter and looked up. "You waited all this time?" "For what?" He met her eyes, and for a moment, the years between them dissolved. "For the right moment to say goodbye properly," she frowned. "Goodbye?" He smiled, but his eyes were full of sorrow. "I've been sick, Sandra. It's not serious yet, but the doctors say it's unpredictable. I didn't want to disappear again without letting you know what you meant to me." Her heart clenched. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because you had your world," he said softly. "And I didn't want my silence to turn into your burden." She stood up, her voice shaking now. "You think I would have cared about that? After everything?" He looked away. "I wasn't sure you still cared at all." The silence that followed was thick with everything they hadn't said. The fire crackled softly, filling the spaces between them. Finally, she stepped closer and placed her hand on his. "You were wrong," she whispered. "Some people never stop caring, even when they think they should." He didn't speak, but his hand tightened around hers. And in that single gesture lived every apology, every memory, every missed chance. They sat like that for a long time, two souls learning to breathe again after years of holding their breath. Outside, the wind grew softer, and the lake shimmered with reflected moonlight. Then Keanu stood and walked to a small wooden chest near the fireplace. He opened it and took out a worn leather notebook. "This," he said, handing it to her, "is the book I've been writing. It's not a script or a story. It's something else." She opened it slowly. The pages were filled with handwritten reflections, thoughts about kindness, about grief, about finding meaning in pain. In the margins were small sketches, faces of people, fragments of places, bits of light caught on paper. Near the last page, one line stood out, written in darker ink. "Sometimes the only way to hold on to someone is to let them see who you became without them." She looked up, her eyes glassy. "This is beautiful," he smiled faintly. "It's unfinished. I was hoping maybe you could help me finish it." The fire crackled again, sending sparks into the air like tiny stars. She wanted to say yes, but before she could, there was a sound outside. A car pulling up, headlights sweeping across the cabin walls. Keanu's expression changed instantly. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. He shook his head. No. The sound of footsteps echoed on the wooden porch, slow and deliberate. Sandra's heartbeat quickened. Keanu moved toward the window, looked out, and his face went pale. What is it? She whispered. He turned back to her, voice low. Someone I never thought would find me. And before she could ask who, the door handle began to turn. The man at the door. The handle turned slowly, the wood creaking under its own age. Sandra's breath caught as the door opened, revealing a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and his expression carried both exhaustion and purpose. The light from the fire flickered across his face, revealing eyes that looked strangely familiar. Keanu didn't move. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale. Sandra looked from one to the other, feeling tension swell between them like a storm that had been waiting years to break. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. You really thought you could disappear, didn't you? Keanu exhaled slowly. I wasn't hiding. I was resting. Resting, the man said with a quiet, bitter laugh. Is that what you call walking away from everything we built? Sandra looked between them, confusion heavy in her chest. Who is he? Keanu hesitated, then said quietly, His name is Mark. He was my writing partner. My closest friend once. Mark stepped inside, ignoring her presence for a moment. Friend, he repeated softly. That's one way to describe it. You left me to face the world alone, Keanu. I tried to defend you, but you vanished. And now you're here, writing letters like some ghost. Keanu's voice stayed calm. I didn't vanish to hurt you, Mark. I left because I couldn't carry what we lost. The air in the cabin tightened. Sandra could sense a history she didn't yet understand. Something about regret, guilt, maybe betrayal. She stepped back quietly, watching their eyes lock like two sides of a wound refusing to close. Mark's expression softened for a second. You could have called, he said. I would have come. I know, Keanu said, and that's why I didn't. Mark frowned. You think I wouldn't understand? You would have tried, Keanu replied. But some things you can't fix for someone else. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the fire cracking softly in the background. Sandra felt like an outsider standing in the middle of unfinished history. Yet something in her heart told her this night was part of the reason she had come. Finally, Keanu turned to her. I should have told you about him. We were working on a story once, about loss, about forgiveness. We were close to finishing it when something happened. Mark interrupted, his voice rising slightly. When someone happened, you mean? Keanu's eyes flicked toward Sandra, then back to Mark. It wasn't her fault. You stopped writing because of her, Mark said. Don't deny it. Sandra stepped forward, voice trembling. That's not fair. I didn't even know you existed. Mark looked at her then, his anger fading into quiet sadness. Maybe not. But he did. And he stopped believing in the story we were telling because his heart went somewhere else. The words cut through the room like glass. Keanu closed his eyes. It wasn't about love, Mark. It was about needing to feel something real again. The story we were writing became too personal, too painful. I couldn't separate fiction from truth anymore. Mark shook his head slowly. And now you're here trying to rewrite it without me. Keanu's voice lowered. No, I'm trying to finish it before time finishes me. That silence again. Sharp, final. Mark looked at him and his anger drained into something like grief. You're sick, he said softly. That's what this is about. Keanu nodded once. Yes. Mark stepped closer, his voice breaking now. You should have told me. I couldn't, Keanu said. I didn't want pity. I wanted peace. Sandra felt tears building again, but she stayed still, watching the two men who had once built something together now standing on opposite sides of what life had taken from them. Finally, Mark exhaled and turned toward the door. You always were stubborn, he said. But I'm not leaving you alone this time. Not again, Keanu tried to smile. You already did enough for me. No, Mark said quietly. This time I'm staying until the end. He walked out to get his things from the car. The moment he left, Sandra turned to Keanu. You never told me you stopped writing because of me. Keanu sighed and sat down by the fire. It wasn't your fault. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, what it meant to feel human again. But that kind of honesty comes with a cost. When I started seeing truth in every word I wrote, it scared me. Because truth is what breaks people open. She sat beside him, her voice almost a whisper. You think waiting all these years made sense of it? He looked at her gently. It wasn't about sense. It was about faith. They sat in silence for a while. The sound of the wind brushing the cabin walls felt almost like a heartbeat. Sandra reached for another one of his letters from the box, opened it, and began to read aloud. To the one who never asked for promises but always inspired them, I hope someday you understand that silence doesn't mean absence. It means I'm still listening. Her voice trembled. You wrote this years ago? Yes, he said softly. I never stopped writing. I just stopped sending. Outside, footsteps returned. Mark came back inside carrying a small duffel bag. He looked calmer now. There's food in the car, he said. And something else. An envelope. Someone left it at my door 2 days ago. It had your name on it, Keanu. He handed it over. Keanu frowned, taking it carefully. There was no sender listed, only a faint mark on the back, a circle drawn around a cross. Sandra noticed it too. What's that symbol? She asked. Keanu's eyes darkened. It's from the story we wrote years ago, he said slowly. The one we never finished. Mark nodded. But how could someone else know that? Keanu tore the envelope open and pulled out a single folded sheet. His hands trembled as he read, and Sandra saw the color drain from his face. What does it say? She asked, voice shaking. He looked up, his eyes filled with disbelief. It says, the story isn't over, not yet. Come to where it began. Mark stepped forward. That's impossible. Only the three of us knew that phrase. The three of us? Sandra repeated. Keanu's voice dropped to a whisper. There was one more person. The one who made us start writing in the first place. Who? He met her eyes. Someone I thought was gone. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, slamming the window shut with a loud crack. The fire flickered, and for a moment, the room dimmed to shadow. Mark looked at him. You think it's a game? Keanu shook his head slowly. No, it's a message. Sandra's pulse quickened. From who? Keanu turned toward the window, his reflection pale in the glass. From the past. Where it began, the night stretched endlessly, the silence inside the cabin heavy with the weight of what none of them yet understood. Keanu sat near the dying fire, the mysterious letter trembling in his hands. Its words were few, but each one felt like a door opening to something they had all tried to lock away. Sandra sat across from him, still trying to steady her breathing. Mark paced near the window, glancing every few seconds toward the lake as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. You said there was someone else? Sandra said quietly. Who was it? Keanu looked up, his expression distant. Her name was Leah. She was the first person who ever believed I could write. Before the movies, before the noise. She helped me and Mark start everything. The story we were writing, it was based on her. Mark stopped pacing. Based on her. It was her, Keanu. She was the reason we started. She was the reason you lost yourself. Sandra frowned, confused. What happened to her? Keanu hesitated. She died, years ago. A car accident on the highway just outside the city. Mark's voice hardened. And you never forgave yourself for it. Keanu closed his eyes. I was supposed to meet her that night. She called me before leaving, said she had something to tell me. I told her I'd be there. But I wasn't. I was late. I never saw her again. Sandra felt her throat tighten. The quiet pain in his voice felt deeper than grief. It was guilt turned into years of silence. And this message, she whispered, you think it's from her? Keanu didn't answer immediately. He turned the paper over in his hands. The symbol on the back, the circle with the cross. She used to draw it on everything. She said it meant closure and beginning at the same time. Mark stepped closer. But that's impossible. No one else could have known that. Keanu looked toward the window where the reflection of the lake shimmered faintly under moonlight. Unless, he said quietly, someone kept her letters. Sandra's eyes widened. Letters? Mark nodded grimly. She used to write to both of us. Small notes, ideas, pieces of her thoughts. After she died, the police gave me her bag. I went through it all. I thought I kept everything. But maybe someone else took what I didn't see. The air in the room grew colder. Sandra felt the hair on her arms rise. Something about this story didn't feel finished, not even after all these years. Keanu stood slowly, folded the paper, and placed it in his jacket pocket. The message says, "Come to where it began." That can only mean one place, the old studio. Mark's expression darkened. That place is abandoned now. Maybe, Keanu said, but someone wants me there. And I can't ignore it. Sandra stepped forward. Then I'm coming with you. He shook his head. No, it might not be safe. Keanu, she said firmly, you've spent half your life hiding from ghosts. If this is the moment to face them, you're not doing it alone. Their eyes met. Calm against fire, fear against determination. Finally, he nodded. All right, but we go at dawn, Mark sighed, rubbing his forehead. You're both insane, Keanu smiled faintly. Probably, but that's how all stories worth finishing begin. The fire burned low. As the night deepened, the three of them sat in silence, old memories flickering in their minds like broken film reels. Sandra watched Keanu's face illuminated by the orange glow, and she realized something strange. Beneath his calm exterior was a man who carried every loss as if it were a promise. And maybe, she thought, that was why people trusted him. Because he never let pain turn into bitterness. When morning came, the world outside the cabin was wrapped in soft fog. They packed quietly, taking only what they needed. As Keanu locked the cabin door, Sandra noticed a small wooden carving above the frame. A circle crossed through the center. She touched it gently. It's her symbol, she said. Keanu nodded. She carved it herself the last time we were here. Mark frowned. I didn't know that. Keanu looked at him. There's a lot we didn't know back then. The drive to the old studio took hours. The road twisted through forests and valleys until finally opening into a flat stretch of land where an abandoned building stood alone, covered in ivy and rust. The old sign above the gate was faded, but the letters could still be read. Harper Sound Stage. Sandra stepped out of the car and felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with unease. The air smelled like dust and rain. It feels like time stopped here, she whispered. Mark kicked a small rock near his feet. It did. The day she died. They entered the studio. Sunlight leaked through broken windows, falling in narrow golden lines across the dusty floor. Old equipment was scattered everywhere. Cameras, cables, reels of film, half unraveled. It felt like a cathedral built for forgotten stories. Keanu walked to the far wall where a large mural was painted. Faded now, but still visible. It was a woman's silhouette surrounded by light, holding a pen. Underneath it were words painted years ago. Every ending is only a truth we couldn't finish. Sandra stared at it, goosebumps running down her arms. Did you paint that? Keanu nodded slowly. The night before she died. It was her idea. Mark's voice was quiet. And you never came back here after that, did you? No, Keanu said. I couldn't. As they stood there, the faint sound of paper fluttering echoed through the studio. Sandra turned. A small breeze had slipped through a broken window, sending something tumbling from a dusty table. She walked toward it. A notebook, its pages yellowed, lying open on the floor. She picked it up and froze. On the inside cover was the same symbol, the circle and cross, and underneath, a short note in familiar handwriting. For when you remember what the story meant. Keanu took it gently from her hands, his fingers trembling. He flipped through the pages. Every one of them was filled with Leah's writing, scenes, dialogues, unfinished lines. The last page, however, was written in a different ink, darker and fresher. Mark leaned closer. That's not her handwriting, Keanu nodded. No, it's mine. Yours? Sandra whispered. He stared at the page, his own forgotten words staring back. I must have written this years ago. Maybe I came here once and blocked it out. The words on the last page read, if one day you find this, it means I finally stopped running. Forgiveness isn't about what happened. It's about accepting that we never stopped caring. For a moment, none of them spoke. Sandra felt tears building behind her eyes. Keanu closed the notebook slowly and pressed it to his chest. Then, from the far end of the studio, came a faint sound, like a door creaking open. Mark turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Keanu nodded. "Someone's here." They moved cautiously toward the sound. Light flickered through a side corridor, and as they reached it, they saw a small projector turned on, casting an image onto the wall. It was an old home video, grainy and warm. Leah appeared on the screen, laughing, her voice echoing through the empty room. "If anyone ever finds this," her recorded voice said, "then it means the story found its ending after all." Keanu stood frozen, his eyes wet. Sandra touched his arm gently, her voice trembling. "She knew you'd come back." Leah's voice continued, softer now, almost whispering. "The truth isn't that we lose people. It's that sometimes they wait for us to be ready to see them again." The film cut to static. Sandra looked at Keanu. "She left this for you?" He nodded, silent. Mark sat down on a broken chair, his face pale. "She planned everything. Even this." Keanu turned to him slowly. "She knew we'd all be here again one day." Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. The storm was coming. Sandra placed her hand on his shoulder. "What do we do now?" Keanu looked toward the fading screen, his reflection trembling in its light. "We finished the story." But as he said it, the projector flickered once more, and this time, new words appeared on the wall. Part 2 of The Truth Waits Where the Water Remembers. Mark stood quickly. "What does that mean?" Keanu whispered, almost to himself. "The lake." Sandra's heart skipped. "You mean the one near your cabin?" He nodded. "That's where it began. And maybe where it ends." As they turned to leave, the projector's light dimmed completely, and in the silence that followed, the wind whispered through the broken windows, almost like a voice saying goodbye, but none of them heard it clearly enough to know whether it was real. The water that remembers. The road back to the lake felt heavier this time, as if the air itself carried memories that refused to rest. The rain had started again, not heavy but steady, drumming against the windshield like a quiet heartbeat. No one in the car spoke for the first hour. Sandra sat in the passenger seat, watching drops race down the glass, while Keanu drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road. Mark sat in the back, lost in thought, his hands clenched around the old notebook they had found at the studio. Each of them felt it, the strange pull of something unfinished. The message from the projector had been clear. Part 2 of The Truth Waits Where the Water Remembers. And the lake, calm and endless, had always been the one place that tied them all together. As they neared the familiar turnoff, fog began to creep through the trees, soft and thick. It rolled across the ground like a living thing, blurring the outlines of everything it touched. Keanu slowed the car and finally stopped near the same cabin where it had all begun. The lantern by the door was still burning, though none of them had left it lit. "That's not possible," Sandra whispered. "We turned that off," Mark frowned. "Someone's been here." They stepped out of the car, their footsteps muffled by wet earth. The air smelled of pine and rain. Keanu walked ahead, his shoulders tense, the letter still tucked in his jacket. When they reached the lake's edge, he stopped. The water was completely still, no ripples, no wind. The surface reflected the cloudy sky like a mirror that didn't want to break. Mark joined him. "So this is where it ends?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "No, this is where it tells us what we missed." Sandra walked closer to the water. She remembered standing there years ago, during that old film shoot, when the lake had shimmered under golden light. Back then, it had felt peaceful. Now, it felt sacred. As she knelt to touch the surface, a small object caught her eye, something floating near the shore. She reached for it and pulled it out. It was a small wooden box worn by time and water. A faded carving marked its lid, the circle and cross again. Keanu stared at it, frozen. "That's hers." Sandra looked up. "Leah's?" He nodded. "She used to keep her stories in boxes like that. Said paper should be close to the earth." Mark helped pry it open. Inside, wrapped carefully in plastic, was a single letter and an old photograph. The photo showed the three of them, Keanu, Mark, and Leah, standing by the same lake, smiling. Sandra turned it over. Written on the back in Leah's handwriting were the words, "For when you remember what we stood for." Keanu opened the letter with trembling fingers. His voice broke as he began to read aloud. "If you are reading this, it means you came back. I always knew you would. I wanted our story to live, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. We wrote about forgiveness, but none of us knew what it meant. We thought it was about saying sorry. It's not. It's about letting the pain stop defining who we are. He paused, his breath catching. Mark stood beside him, eyes glistening. Sandra felt her throat tighten. Keanu continued. If the world ever feels heavy again, go back to where the water remembers. That lake will always carry your reflection, not as who you were, but as who you could still become. He folded the letter and looked at them. She knew we'd lose our way. She planned this. Mark wiped his eyes roughly. She always planned everything, even the part where we broke apart. For a long time, none of them moved. The only sound was the soft ripple of water and the wind brushing the trees. Then Sandra noticed something else, a glimmer beneath the surface of the lake, faint but visible like light reflecting off glass. There, she said. Pointing, Keanu stepped forward, knee-deep into the water, and reached down. After a moment, he pulled out a small metal box, sealed shut and rusted around the edges. Mark rushed to help him open it. Inside was a tape recorder, old but still intact, wrapped in waterproof fabric. How is that even possible? Sandra whispered. Keanu looked at the recorder. She used to record everything. Ideas, thoughts, dreams. Maybe this is one of them. Mark found a small generator inside the cabin and hooked it to an old speaker. The machine whirred weakly, then came to life with a faint crackle. Static filled the air, followed by the sound of a soft, familiar voice. Keanu, Leah's voice said through the static. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't get to tell you everything. Keanu froze. Sandra reached for his hand, but he couldn't take his eyes off the recorder. You once told me that stories are just ways to make sense of loss, Leah continued. But you were wrong. Stories are how we remind the world that love survives loss, that kindness doesn't vanish when people do. Her voice wavered slightly, then steadied. I'm leaving something behind, not for closure, but for continuation. Someone will need to finish what we started. And if you're still waiting, Keanu, then maybe it was never about me at all. Maybe it was about learning how to stay open to the world after it breaks you. The tape ended abruptly. Mark turned it off slowly. She knew you, he said quietly. Better than anyone. Keanu nodded, his voice barely audible. She still does. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds began to part, letting a narrow beam of sunlight fall across the lake. The reflection shimmered, golden and soft, like the surface was breathing again. Sandra stepped closer to Keanu. She wanted you to live, not wait. He looked at her, eyes full of quiet sadness. I thought waiting was love. She shook her head gently. Maybe it was. But now it's time to let love mean living. Mark exhaled deeply, staring at the water. So what happens now? Keanu glanced down at the notebook Mark still held. We finish it, he said. Her story, our story. We write the ending she deserved. They returned to the cabin as the afternoon light deepened into amber. The rain-washed world outside glowed softly through the windows. Keanu placed the notebook and the letter on the table, then looked at both of them. We'll write together, he said. Not as writers, not as friends, but as people who finally understand what she meant. Mark sat down, opening the first blank page. Where do we start? Keanu smiled faintly. With the truth. Sandra took the pen and began to write, her voice quiet but sure as she spoke each line aloud. It was never about the ending. It was about learning to keep going, even when everything beautiful feels gone. Keanu looked at her, and for the first time in years he smiled. Not the polite kind, but the kind that carried peace outside. The lake shimmered under the fading sun, rippling as if it were alive, remembering. But as they wrote through the night, a faint knock echoed at the cabin door. Soft, hesitant but unmistakably real, Mark froze. Who could that be? Keanu stood, his face unreadable. Maybe it's not over yet. He walked toward the door, the floor creaking under his slow steps, and opened it. A figure stood outside in the moonlight, a woman, her face hidden beneath a rain-soaked hood. She looked up, and Sandra gasped softly. Her eyes, those eyes, were the same as in the old photograph. You? Keanu whispered. That can't be. The woman smiled faintly. Some stories, she said softly. don't end where you think they do. And before any of them could speak, the light flickered, and everything went dark. The story that waited to be told, the power went out. The sound of rain returned, harder this time, hitting the roof like 1,000 quiet knocks from the sky. The cabin fell into darkness, except for the faint silver glow of moonlight pushing through the windows. Sandra's heart pounded as she turned toward the doorway. The woman still stood there, soaked, silent, her breath visible in the cold air. Keanu took a step forward, his face pale but calm. "Who are you?" he asked softly. The woman lifted her hood. Her hair clung to her face, wet and dark. But her eyes, those calm, steady eyes, caught the moonlight like they carried another time inside them. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "I didn't come to haunt you," she said quietly. "I came because you finally stopped running." Sandra froze. The voice was unmistakable, soft, low, and full of something that didn't feel like the living world. Keanu whispered her name like a prayer. "Aaliyah," the woman smiled faintly. "I told you once that stories never die. They wait." Mark stumbled backward, his voice trembling. "This isn't possible." "She's gone. We buried her." "You buried what you could touch," Leah said gently, "but not what was left behind. The story, the love, the forgiveness. Those things don't belong to graves." Keanu's eyes filled with tears. He wanted to move closer, but fear and awe kept him still. "Why now?" he asked. "After all this time, why come back now?" "Because you're finally ready to hear what you couldn't then," she said. "You kept blaming yourself for my death. You thought you failed me. But it wasn't your fault. I wasn't on my way to see you that night. I was on my way to save someone else." Silence filled the cabin. Sandra stepped closer, whispering. "Who?" Leah looked down, her voice fading almost to a whisper. "A man who once believed his pain was all he had. I thought if I reached him, maybe I could save him. I never did. But I saved something else, and the story. The one we started." Mark shook his head, tears forming. "You mean—" "Yes," she said softly. "You both carried my unfinished dream, even when you didn't know it." The story was never about loss. It was about learning to wait with kindness, not fear. She turned toward Keanu, her expression full of quiet peace. "You waited, Keanu. Not for me, but for meaning. That's why you could never stop. Because part of you knew that love isn't what ends when someone leaves. It's what stays behind when everything else falls away." He reached out his hand, trembling. "Are you really here?" She smiled gently. "In every word you write, in every silence you forgive. Yes, I'm here." The wind blew softly through the open doorway, carrying with it the smell of rain and pine. The lantern outside flickered, its light catching on the edges of her face. For a moment, it looked as if she was made of light itself. Fragile, shimmering, but alive. Mark stepped closer, voice breaking. "We wanted to finish the story for you." Leah looked at him, eyes soft. "Then finish it." "But not for me." "Finish it for yourselves, because every story worth telling is really about finding your way back to being human again." She turned to Sandra then, her voice warm. "And you were never part of the past. You were the bridge to the future. You reminded him that life still waits to be lived." Sandra felt tears fall freely down her face. "I don't know what to say." "Say thank you," Leah whispered. "Not to me, but to time, for letting you meet when you were both broken enough to understand each other." A quiet peace filled the cabin. The storm outside began to fade, the thunder moving farther away. The woman's figure seemed softer now, fading gently with the wind. Keanu took another step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Will I ever see you again?" Leah smiled, the kind of smile that carried eternity. "Every time you choose peace instead of pain, you will." And then she was gone. The rain stopped. The lantern outside went dark. The world fell still. Mark stood in silence, staring at the empty doorway. Did that really just happen? Keanu didn't answer. He walked slowly to the window, looking out at the lake. The water shimmered softly, reflecting the moonlight, calm and endless. He spoke quietly as if to himself. The water remembers. Sandra joined him at the window. She wanted you to forgive yourself, he nodded. And to live. She took his hand gently. Then live. They stood there together as dawn began to break over the horizon, the light spilling across the lake like a promise being kept. Mark sat by the table, opened the notebook, and began to write. Hours passed. Words flowed easily now, not forced, not planned. Every sentence felt like closure unfolding into peace. When they finished, Keanu wrote the final line with slow, careful strokes. And when the silence finally spoke, it said only this: love is not waiting. Love is remembering. He closed the notebook and placed it gently on the windowsill. Outside, the sun had risen fully, turning the surface of the lake into a field of light. Sandra watched him, her voice soft. What happens now? Keanu smiled faintly, a calm that hadn't touched his face in years. Now we let go. They walked down to the water together. Keanu held the notebook close for a long moment, then placed it on a small wooden raft Mark had built overnight. The three of them watched as it drifted slowly across the lake, sunlight glinting on its wet cover. When it reached the middle, a breeze caught it, spinning it gently, and for a moment, just for a heartbeat, the reflection of a woman appeared on the surface, smiling before vanishing back into the ripples. Sandra leaned her head against Keanu's shoulder. She's home. He nodded, tears in his eyes but peace in his heart. She always was. The wind carried the scent of rain and pine through the air. Birds began to sing softly in the distance. The world, once heavy with silence, now breathed again. They turned and walked back to the cabin, not as broken souls searching for meaning, but as people who had found it. Keanu stopped once more at the door, looking out over the water. "Thank you," he whispered. Not to the air, but to everything that had waited for him to understand. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt light, as if every unanswered letter, every long night of waiting, every unspoken word had finally found its home. The story that began in silence ended not with goodbye, but with peace.